So I think the phrase that really best describes 2020, I know we've all heard necessity drives invention, but in this case it was necessity drives adoption. What we really saw was a pull forward of secular trends that have really been in place and been drivers of digitization of the enterprise, over the last several years. At the enterprise level specifically, the adoption of video conferencing certainly was pulled forward by the necessity to communicate, with clients and business prospects. Who also pulled forward as a result of the COVID shutdowns, the mobility of the workforce as employees were forced to more aggressively work from home, right? Which meaningfully accelerated that adoption curve. All of those facets then really fed into the enterprise's focus on shoring up all of their network resources. So there was a large investment in making sure you had speed of access. So from a broadband services perspective, your communications and telecommunications infrastructure. You wanted to make sure that you had your software in the cloud, and on top of that, security services, which is another piece that we're going to talk about because cybersecurity is increasingly important. I think what it also brought forward was the realization of the importance of the value of digital assets and digital investment. So consumer companies have been investing, in e-commerce and their digital apps for the last several years, but as the consumer was really restricted from shopping in-store, e-commerce became increasingly important, and we saw penetration surge to historic highs. What that then subsequently, I think, necessitated and pulled forward as well was then the advancement into convenience services. So we saw buy online, pick up in store really start to accelerate. That then moved to curbside as consumers were more reluctant to be in store, but still wanted same day access to their goods and services. And then that then subsequently moved into same day delivery, which started out from, in groceries and consumer goods. And if you, take a look at the offerings today, you can get anything delivered same day, from pet food, pet supplies, groceries to sporting goods. So the digital assets certainly became more valuable. We think that absolutely has staying power. Over and above that, beyond just the goods component, we also saw a pull forward, I think, in the, digitization of the services aspect of the economy, as consumers were forced to do more banking online, shop for insurance services online, shop for automobiles online. So that digitization of services aspect, was also, a pretty meaningful, acceleration in what had already been a secular trend. Over and above that, as I mentioned previously, I think, what became very, very apparent, especially in, the last so many weeks with those very high profile cyber attacks, is that as the world moves to digital, as your employees are off premise, it's increasingly important to invest in cybersecurity. That has been a secular trend that's been in place for the last couple of years, but we actually see investment there accelerating, given all of the aforementioned, secular trends. And I think over and above that, something outside of the technology space, but something that we had talked about for some time, was in the housing area, and particularly with the millennials. So it had long been thought, I should say, that the millennials were never going to move out of their parents' homes, and when they did, they were living in the city, and they were never going to be. This was going to be a different generation. They weren't going to move to the suburbs and do what generations before them had traditionally done. And I think what COVID had really changed, or at least accelerated, was our perception and the reality that this generation, the millennial generation, was going to follow the path of previous generations. And we saw a meaningful acceleration in housing sales, which we think will also necessitate, a tail to consumer spending, over and above what we're going to see from stimulus here in 2021. So pretty meaningful, broad-based set of acceleration in what I think were already secular trends. So I think the one interesting thing, about this recessionary environment relative to others is that there really doesn't appear to be any lasting structural changes to behavior. There doesn't appear to be any, I don't think at this point, longer term change to how consumers will look to consume goods, will look to consume services, in that, I don't see a permanent change in their desire to pursue those behaviors. The avenues, like we talked about, I think are definitely changed. I think once you introduce convenience into the equation, that's something that absolutely has staying power. And any retailer that you talk to today will absolutely tell you the same thing. I think that also has necessitated change in the supply chain and also changed in the value of the store, right? It was I think there was a long thought that the stores conceptually were outdated, but I think what COVID actually proved was that there's value to have an inventory closer to the consumer, and being that store giving them the ability to add all of those convenience aspects: buy online, pick up in store, the same day delivery, and all of those facets. So that is absolutely something that's going to stick moving forward. And then so without any structural impediments, I think the biggest obstacles really as we sit here today is certainly getting businesses back to business, reopening the economy, re-engaging employees to come back to work in situations where they haven't, and re-ramping the supply chain. I mean, there was some pretty substantial disruption. If you think about where companies and enterprises were, coming into, April, with the advent of COVID, the massive closures, companies were aggressively paring back and canceling orders. Stimulus then necessitated a significant drawdown in inventory as consumers spent aggressively. So now what you're seeing on the supply chain side, both not just for consumer consumption, but also in the industrial supply chain as well, is that inventories have been drawn down fairly meaningfully, and we are working aggressively to re-ramp those, which is creating some obstacles. It's creating some short-term, it's creating some inflation in the channel as demand is exceeding supply, as the economy has recovered at a much quicker pace. So, to the degree that the economy continues to recover at an accelerating pace, these feel to be transient issues, but we're definitely on the lookout for signs of, stepped up inflation being more durable.